Hello, welcome to this JSON for Beginners course, and my name is Nabit Madan, and I will try to, help you understand JSON in the most basic and simple way. The intention of creating this course is to help anyone who is who doesn't have any understanding of JSON but wants to know and understand it. So that's where this motivation came, and in this. In this course, we plan to cover is understand first what is JSON, and then once we understood the JSON, then it will be like comparing it to XML, how it differs and what are similarities. Then from there, we will start digging into its syntax, types, what are objects, array, and how do we basically read and modify stuff. So once those are done, we will basically look at some examples, but it will be mostly a example, practical course, less for theory, more of learn by doing, we'll learn by doing things. So it's a learn by doing approach. So let's get started without wasting further much time. So let's first have a look at what is JSON and then what exactly it is. Okay. So what is JSON? So it basically stand for JavaScript Object Notation. Okay, it's more likely similar to what how we represent objects in JavaScript. The similar way it is those kind of formats are used here, and it is nothing but a data exchange format. Hold on to this. We'll get into the detail of how JSON is in data exchange format. It's lightweight. We'll also see in one of the another example. That is when we will compare XML and JSON. That is where will see that how it is lightweight and it is easily understandable and readable. So so what exactly it is it is something just we understand that it is okay. It's some format of data. Okay, so when suppose there is a client server which interacts, the way you want to send the data to the client needs to interpret it, right? It needs to understand, for example, whether you are sending it rows of table, right? Or whether you are sending it a structure, whether you are sending it an array, right? So it needs to understand that. So how do we define that, whether it is a table, whether it contains single line, whether it contains multiple fields? So that is what this JSON format defines. Okay, and it is very easily readable and understandable. We'll see through it once we start working with examples. So as of now, it is quite lightweight and easily understandable. Let's just understand this data exchange format via some illustration. So for example, we have any browser, anything which is a client. It can be any browser which you feel like, and we have a server. It can be any Node.js, ASP.NET, any SAV, whatever server it is, right? So normally what happens is that client sends a request and server responds, right? But the response has to be in a particular format, right? So the browser will be able to kind of understand that, is able to use that format and display it, right? So that response format, so that client can understand, can be in JSON, right? Which is what we are going to cover here, or it can be in XML also, right? So where you have open tag, close tag, and all this. We are not going to cover XML basics, that is a talk for some other day, but it is that this response, how your data will be structured is what we are going to talk about, right? So that in particular it will be more about JSON, right? So that's where this format of data comes in, and that's where JSON is used, and it is very easily understandable and readable, plus it is lightweight. We'll look at that. So this we understand, okay, this is JSON, something how we format the data so that my client can understand. Let's now have a look at two examples so that you understand it in a detailed way. On the left hand side, what you see is a JSON format. Okay, all let's not think about these curly braces, square brackets. Don't worry, we'll cover them. All I can do is I can read through it that I say that it has entity set, it has some products, categories, and supplier. Very easily readable. You will understand its meaning also, but as of now, it's very easily readable. On right hand side is same response. It is a response from a server, but in a XML way, where you can see there's a service open tag, right? And then there's a closure of service, right? And then there is a collection atom title with workspace, which is opening, and then you see workspace closing. Then there's a title default. Then you see there's products, right? The products which you see here, the same products. They are under the collection. So as you can see, XML one is, it is readable, but it's very JSON is very easily readable, right? And it is very lightweight if you look at this. It just occupies these many lines, and here you can see. So these both have formats of data, right? One is JSON, and another is XML, and we expect this. The JSON is the basically lightweight, and it is very scalable one. So now we had a look at what is JSON and JSON versus XML, kind of a very simple and straightforward, easy comparison. I think it makes sense to, without wasting further much time, we should directly jump to some the next topic, which is our syntax, data type, objects, and arrays, right? And for that, I think the easiest way to do out is like let's do it in Chrome browser, right? And I will use developer console where I will, we'll be using JavaScript as a language. You can use PHP, whatever you're comfortable with. Important is for us is to understand what is the syntax, how does it look like. We'll use Chrome as well as VS Code. You can choose any. So so what I will do is let me just bring in the terminal or the VS Code here, right? And we have it's nothing done so far. I've just opened a folder named JSON, and all I'm going to create is a file named my file.json. So normally a JSON file, and if you want to have it as JSON data, you will end it with an extension .json. Okay. So normally, since it's an object notation, right, you can have it as an we'll talk about object as well as arrays. So let's, for the timing, all we do is we understand, we make a curly braces, open and close. What it means is that this is an object. Now this object is similar to our JavaScript object, or let me make it a bit bigger right here. It is similar to our JavaScript objects, right? Or any OOPS object, object-oriented object, right? But object as in where they have properties, they contain data, right? Only difference is it only contains data, but no methods. Okay, so that's the basic difference. So JSON will always contain data, but no methods like, for example, you have in your normal class, right? So let's say that this is an object, right? And so this is an object, and let's see how do we add this properties to it, or let me call it as property so that you're able to link it, but later I will change it. For example, what do we take an example? Let's take an example of a employee. Okay, so what you have is like we have fields in the table. Same way, what we have is define the fields there, and we need to use inverted commas. So we say ID, right? And if it is if you want to use a number, you just do it without single quotes. If you want it in a string, you can have it something like this. Or if you want to have it a boolean value, you can use true, right, or false. If you want to define it as null, you can use it as a null. Okay, so let's say that there's an employee named ID employee, which it's an employee kind of a structure. So left hand side is like a key, and right hand side is like a value. Okay, so this is key, this is value, and I say ID is 1. Then you put a comma at the end, and then you say name is, for example, Naveed, and then you say company, and because I work with mobilitas, so I'll write that name. And for example, I'm a freelancer, yes or no. Contractor is a better word, I think. Contractor, I say false. right? So let's just look at this for timing. So what I have done is I've defined, if you look at this, it is very similar to like a structure, which has multiple fields. One is a key, another is a value. So here I'm using, the left hand side is key, this value here it is string, and let me make it as numeric, right? The name is string, company is mobilitas, contractor is false. So this whole inside a curly braces, it means it is like an object. Okay, and then there is another type also. Let's sort that also. For example, DOJ, which is date of joining. Let me keep it as null for the time. Okay, so that's how we normally define that this is an ID. How do we define a JSON data? This JSON object is very basic. Okay, now the next level is, for example, an employee has its address, right? It has its street, it has its city, pin code, and country, right? One way is I can have it something like city, right? And I can say city is Panchkula, where I live, right? And then country is India. Then let's add the pin code last one, and because it is numeric, so 134109. So this is one way, right? So, but I think that should be something like uh, more like an inner structure, right? So instead of this, what we can do is we can also have something like let me create one more file, my file one, so that I can compare it totally. Okay, so let me open it here and let's just close it. Yeah. So instead of this, we can also have something like address, right? And then then we can have this one. I move. Uh, okay. So now what I've done is this whole thing. It is because it's an address is like a combination, right? It is like it does many things. So that's why rather than having it here, I add it as an address, and which is nothing but also internally like a structure and object. So it's like an curly braces means an object, right, which contains multiple fields, right, and keys or values or fields, and then in that objects can also contain another objects. It's like these, right? So now we have an object inside an object. Okay, that's perfectly fine. So this is better than this one, right? Now what do we have next? So we explored, we have so far we understood key value, we understood different types, we understood how can we have object inside object, and you can also have an object inside an object here also. Suppose sample, and you, if you want, you can keep make it more nested, something like test key and field and value is this. So it's like object inside object, another level of nesting, right? So it depends on perfectly on how you want to structure your data, but it is very easily readable. Okay, so now moving on, one thing is, okay, so before we move on, so we know that employee has master data, then it has address, which is like object inside object, but employee also have salary slips, right? So which is like multiple entries. For example, I cannot have something like January 1, January 2021 salary as 10, right? Or February 2021 as 20, and and March 2021 as 21. Okay, this is how I can have my salary, right? But don't you think this is like this looks, because this thing will keep on increasing, right? And each time it keeps on increasing, does it mean that I will always change the structure? No, right? We will not do that. There must be some option to have multiple, multiple salaries, right? Something like where we can specify this is a month and this is a salary. This is a month. This is a salary. This is a month. This is a salary. So that's where we have something called as arrays also. So arrays is like when you have a defined structure, but that repeat itself. So how do we do that? So let's say that we have this as salary. Okay, and for arrays you use normally square brackets, this one, right? So I have an array now, right? Inside it, what I have is month. I say Jan, right? And I say, let's say also add year, and we say 2021, and then I will say salary is 10. Okay, so that's one line item, which is and now I want another one. So all I need to do is let me just copy paste this, and now I have separate one, right? And this is my salary. So now you see what is the difference? The difference is that now what I have done is, let me just press save. What I've done is that this is not scalable, right? This is not scalable. Each time, every month, every year, you have a salary, you will add one more field. No. So what you have is, in case you have repetitive rows with a definite structure, they can be a different. Some structure can be different also, but let's assume it is the same one. For example, in this case, you can put it as an array. So this square bracket means an array, and this curly braces means an array of objects, right? So we have these two objects which are inside this. Okay, so what we have seen till now is we understood what different types are there. These are primitive one. Then we understood, okay, if these are primitive ones, okay, we added, I think, address. Under address, I added the salary. I think that doesn't make sense. Now it makes sense. I will add just a comma. Don't forget this comma. Now it makes sense, right? Let me just format it here. So address. So once we have basic type, then I introduce that, okay, this is an object, but an object can also have inside an object. So that's where we have it. Then we said that what about multiple line items? That's where we bring in the arrays, right? And then inside arrays, we have objects, and this also can have an inside can have an array also. For example, I can have it something like this also. So it's all how do you want to structure, but isn't it very easily readable, right? It's pretty easily and it's pretty easy and it's readable, right? You can very easily read it. So this is about the basic concepts of types, of objects and arrays, right? But then the question comes as, okay, that if the but how do we read it? How do we kind of access these values? So for that, what we will do is we will use, we can do it here also, but for that I don't want to do that setup so that you have to also do it, right? So I want to use the most basic setup, which is we will use the Chrome Developer Console. So we'll move towards Chrome Developer Consoles and see how do we basically read and kind of modify these JavaScript object notation data, which is JSON.
So now we have understood how do we define our JSON, how do we define its object properties, how do we define arrays, how do we define nested objects or arrays inside arrays also, or arrays inside objects also. But the question is how do we access them? So let's go and have a look at that. So if this is my simple browser, Chrome. You can open any browser, and if you click on these three dots, click on more tools, you go to developer tools. So this is what your typically developer console is. I will not go into details of how it works because that is altogether a different big topic. So for us, our focus will be on console. Okay, so what we will do is we'll try to see how do we access this JSON data using JavaScript. Okay, so what I will do is I will declare two objects. One is this, and then we'll see how do we access them. Okay, so let me just copy this and I will call it as var my detail is equal to this. Okay, and another will be my detail multiple, because I have multiple salary slips just to distinguish them. So I will have these two. So now if you look at, let me just clear it. If you look at employee not employee, my detail. You see this is an object which contains all our fields, right? And then if you look at this is object which contains our another field. This care is bracket, then curly is an object inside. So for example, same goes for address. Okay, so let's first now try to understand how do we work around with this simple object. So for example, in case in JavaScript you have to access the property of this object, all you need to do is write this dot, use dot. In case you want to modify it, you can do it using equal to. Some languages, different programming languages use hyphen, some uses else. So it depends on, vary from language to language. Important for you guys is to understand that how do we access and how do we move around it. So now I know how do we access it, how do I modify it, how do I delete it. So for that we can say my detail dot city, and if I now check my detail dot city, it is undefined. Okay, pretty good. So this is good. Now you must be thinking, okay, this is how we access this simple one, but how do we access this one, an object inside object or an arrays, right? For that, let's look at the other one. So if I say my detail mult, right? So what you can see is, let's look at first address. So dot address is in itself an object, right? So all you need to do in case you have an object is to use a dot. So for example, now, right, you can see this using dot dot dot, I'm going inside. Okay, now this is how, and the same way you can change it also. If you change it to Chandigarh, so it is same, right? Now let's see how do we, okay, we know how do we access object inside objects, but what about salaries? Right, let's look at salaries. Salary is an array, multiple one, right? So 0 1. So first one, if you want to access, you can have it as 0. So you can see month Jan 10 21, and in case you want to access this object property, you need to use simple dot. So here we are using dot, somewhere it results. And in case you want to loop it, you can loop it using the typical for each map or whatever suits you, right? So that is how we normally access these different variables and modify them, right? And normally what happens is that once you are making some calls to the backend, the data goes also as a text and come as a text, right? And in case our medium of communication is using JSON, so how do we send this JSON as a text and modify it as a text? So what we use is as follow. There is an object named JSON. Let me say JSON string, JSON dot stringify, right? And what it does is it will create a string out of your object. So you can see this, it has ID, name, company, everything is now stringify, right? So JSON is available in JavaScript, Chrome, and in Python you might have something else. In PHP you might have something else. Okay, for example, in PHP I remember we have JSON underscore decode, JSON underscore encode. So that's how you will encode your string. You will make a JSON string if you want to send some data to the backend. Let's say you get this response from the backend, right? How do you convert it back into a JSON object or a JavaScript object? So for that, what you can do is, let's say JSON object is equal to, again, JSON dot parse, and you say JSON string. And if I now just log this, you can see we already have this one. So that's how you normally the interaction happens while you make a AJAX call or something. You send text, you receive text, and you're using JSON. Then this is how it works. So I think now we understand in detail how you define a JSON file, how do you access it, its properties, its arrays, its objects, and how do you basically modify things. So we have seen how do we kind of modify and access or delete those properties. But I think it makes sense that because an object can have multiple properties, how do you revolve through, or how do we loop through all of them? For example, this is object hour 1, right? What if I need to I don't need to hard code, I just want to read through all properties. So how you can do is you can say for prop in my detail, right? I'm just looping through those properties, and I am trying to just say that you whatever is a property, you just console log. All right, and I just pen. So it gives me all properties: ID, name, company, contractor. This is what we have, right? This is how we access the value of the name property names. But what about its values? So for that, what we can do is there's another way. It is like, in case you want to access any property, you can say my detail prop. Okay, so in this way it will basically get you those values. So you can see there is console log 1 detail, and if I look at this, so it is 1 Nabith, right? So this square bracket, that's how another way of where you can access these properties, and you can kind of then print those values, right? And then, for example, what if, let's look at my detail multi, right? Now in this we have array, right? Salary, right? So how do we go through that, right? For example, what we can do is, one of the traditional ways, this for loop, right, which we have everywhere. For I is equal to 0, then I less than my detail multi dot salary dot length, and then plus plus. Another way is basically how we can do is, we can have my detail mult dot salary dot for each. Okay, and then you can have another function. You can say number, right, and then you say not number, it's a salary, right, and then you say console dot log salary. Okay, so that is like another way of using a loop. So it basically, I loop through each entry, right, and it logs through all the things. This is a callback function, which is a concept of JavaScript. For you, just being a beginner, we can assume it is just looping through this array one by one. So that's how we normally do the array and object operation. You can use different operations, different ways as per your programming language. So now we have covered all the objects, arrays, basic properties and everything. I think it makes sense to now cover one more thing, which is like, how do we validate a JSON or beautify or generate some data. So maybe we'll look at that in the next session. So we have now covered all the operations which happen on JSON, right? Whether it is reading the arrays, objects, loops and everything, basic one. I think it makes sense to cover one more thing, which is, I think, is how do we validate whether it is a valid JSON or not. So online you can have there's one tool named JSON lint, right, which you can use to validate your JSON. So all you need to do is let's say I bring this up and paste here, and I click on valid, it's a valid JSON. For example, if I remove this comma, then it clearly tells me that this is not a valid JSON, right? And it also tells you where the mistake is, that this is on line 11, there's one comma which is missing. Or for example, if I have an extra one, then it tells you that okay, there is an extra. So JSON validator is very important. In VS Code also you can have your own. Then another is Json Beautifier. Okay, so for Json Beautifier, this is the one which I normally refer. For example, we will let's make it bit of unfriendly, right? And I say that this is my JSON, right? And this also does serve as a purpose of validator also. For example, if I write this, then it can clearly show you that okay, this is an invalid one, right? I do this and I say beautify, so it beautifies it. And in that you can also have your beautification option, right? And with how many tabs you need, and even if you want to minify it, it will do it minification. So that's how normally you can do a linter. You can use this jsonlint.com. I'll put in the link in the resources. The beautifier. One more is, so what if you have to generate those dummy data, JSON dummy data? How do you do it? Is so for that you can use this JSON data generator, right? So I normally use this JSON generator, right? And you can this is something like you need to, this is a JSON generator where you can provide that, okay, how many let's say address you want a state, then integer, this value has to be between 100 and 1000, and then phone has to be something like this, right? Email has to be like this. So basically you can here pass the kind of formatter, so it's like you pass the function. So for example, I need an index which should be like keep on increasing 1 2 3 4, repeat is 5 7, a kind of a loop, this many entries, age has to be an integer between 20 40. So all you need to do is provide your condition and just say generate, and you have is your generator. So these are, I think, 3 very handy tools which I have been using to get around my dummy data, beautification, as well as linter, and I hope it makes sense to you also. Thank you everyone for completing this course. I hope I make some sense. You are able to understand what JSON is. You can take it up to the next level by using this, reading those files, JSON parsing and stuff, whatever you feel like. And then maybe in our next courses we'll try to bring on this. We'll try to get something where we get more comfortable and easy with Chrome and Chrome developer console or some other ideas. Feel free to provide your feedback in your comments, ratings, and in case you have any suggestion, I'll be happy to accommodate and we'll try to work on them. Thank you. Thanks everyone for watching. Thanks so much. Keep sharing, keep learning.